Well, welcome back everybody to the final panel of the day. What a great day's discussion we have already had, and very much looking forward to this discussion, where our small job is to reimagine the civil service for the 21st century. That should take just slightly over an hour. And I guess the underlying question here is it a time for radical change? Is it time for us to take this Rolls-Royce civil service off the road, put a new engine in, some new wings on probably, or something like that? Or are we just updating this machine for the 21st century? I'm delighted to have a wonderful panel alongside me to discuss these questions. Their full biographies are, of course, in your conference pamphlet, but immediately to my left is Dr. Anjana Ahuja. Ange is a science journalist, writes for the Financial Times, has a PhD in space physics, and co-authored an excellent book, and I'm going to wave it because it's that good. I'm reading it at the moment. I recommend it, called Spike, with Jeremy Farrar on the UK government's response to the COVID pandemic. Seated next to Ange is Jonathan Slater, former Permanent Secretary at the Department for Education. I think in our pamphlet we've actually labelled him as a former UK government minister. Just to be clear, that's fake news.
Or ahead of you.
It could be looking into the future. And next to Jonathan we have Dr. Hannah White, who is Director of the Institute for Government, which of course spends a lot of time thinking about the civil service, government, and how we can improve both. And the reason I'm delighted to have this panel is because, in a way, there are three lines of argument about what's wrong with the civil service. There's sort of an institutional structural story. The problem is the structures are wrong. There is a cultural story. That, you know, if we don't fix the culture, we're not going to fix civil service decision making. And there is a skills story. And the three panellists have expertise across those three stories, if you like. So to get into the first of those, and based on the discussion in the first three sessions, I'm actually going to start with you, Ange. I was trying to keep score in the first three sessions, but I think essentially we got to a place where civil servants need to be engineers, AI specialists, anthropologists, classicists were in there, and project managers. It's a lot. So my question, Ange, for you in a sense, is what's the right skill set for the modern civil service, and how much does that include science in particular?
Excellent, and my 5 minutes starts now to completely reform the skill set of the civil service. So first of all, I would like to say thank you to the Bennett Institute for inviting me to speak. And I should really say at the outset that I've never worked in policy. I've never been a civil servant, so quite what I'm doing here, I don't quite know. But I do write in my weekly column for the FT about science, tech and global health, and I'm particularly interested in how it affects people's lives. So from that point of view, I'm at the external side of policy, if you like, both as a citizen and as an observer. So when we go back to the Northcote Trevelyan report, it's really interesting that when the civil service was set up, in that incarnation, that some of these skills that were kind of sought after were things like excellence in history, jurisprudence, modern languages, political economy, and then right at the end, a bit of mathematics. And for me, the missing aspect really is natural sciences. And I don't particularly mean that in a STEM official, kind of a formal way, because I really want to clarify that I don't think when we talk about skilling up the civil service, or anyone actually, I'm not really talking about people going away and getting a physics, biology or a chemistry degree. It's about cultivating a scientific way of thinking. And when we think about that, when we think about the problems that we face, we've already heard about AI, we've got population ageing, we've got climate, we've got energy, we've got water, all often interlocking. These are big quantitative social, political and qualitative challenges. But then again, I am a journalist, so I do have a listicle here, and where Gillian, my colleague, gave you 4 I's, I'm going to give you at least 5 C's. So what kind of skills, or what kind of skill set do we need? I think the first thing to say is all the civil servants I've ever met have been incredibly clever and thoughtful and well informed. So you don't need a science degree in order to develop some of these skills. So the first is just to be a curious and connected citizen. And I really felt that in the pandemic when ministers and civil servants were saying, we can't understand why kids aren't going to school. And actually, if you just talk to somebody in the supermarket who was a key worker, and she said, well, I'm not sending my kids to school because the private schools are shut. And the message she got were that state schools were being kept open because working class kids were expendable. So that's the first thing, gives you a context once you're curious and connected. You need to be able to collate evidence. So what evidence is out there in the relevant policy space? What kind of institutes are involved in gathering it? Who are the people? Where are the networks that can give you an in on this? And that again goes back to being curious. Being able to commission evidence if it's lacking. Very often I think you find that if there is a think tank in a particular space, they have a vested interest in putting out policy papers because they're so easy for overworked ministers to just pick an off-the-shelf policy up and just implement it whole scale. And I think sometimes we don't look enough at the kind of quality of evidence there is. And so we need to, sometimes I think commissioning it is a good idea, and I know that happens. Critiquing it, you don't need to be a science graduate to be able to develop a sense of what good quality evidence looks like. And as I say, it doesn't always have to be a pamphlet from a partisan think tank. Challenging, and I think that this probably speaks to a cultural mindset in the civil service. I think there needs to be a culture of challenge. When I look back at the pandemic and realise when I was talking to people, probably in the advisory committees, some of whom were in a civil service capacity, that they weren't quite clear what ministers wanted. Did they want to minimise infections? Did they want to keep everything open? Did they want to stop infections? There was a lack of clarity often about what the objective of the government was during the pandemic. And so some clarity and challenge from civil servants is always really good. And not only challenging others, and challenging on the basis, on challenging the quality of evidence that is used to make policy and to implement action, but also being prepared to be challenged, because that's how scientists go about their business. You can only find the holes in something once people really, really challenge you on it. How am I doing? Oh, I've gone over 5 minutes. But the other 2 things which are more broad, which is cross-departmental working, is another C. I think that comes up quite a lot. And continuity, something that Greg Clark talked about. Allowing people to build up a hinterland of expertise, I think, in a particular area. And I think my last comment really is that I think those transformations, both getting STEM graduates in, because they still are in a minority, but also just cultivating those skills in people who aren't STEM graduates, I think is just a matter of due diligence. Because I do think it's extraordinary that I'm expected as a science graduate to know the Shakespearean canon, but cabinet ministers don't necessarily know how to read a graph.
There's so much we could pick up on that, and we will. But Jonathan, if I can come to you with another C, which is culture. So in your 2022 paper on fixing the Whitehall policy machine, you made a fair sort of critique of the cultural leadership of the civil service and how we can bring the civil service closer to citizens, closer to people. To what extent do you think the civil service is too detached? And is that a question of cultural tradition, or is that a deliberate choice, or what is driving that detachment?
Detached? It's not as if the head of the civil service is a member of the Garrett Club. So I was lucky enough to be a civil servant 20 years. I worked for Tony Blair, for Jack Straw, for John Reid, for Charlie Faulkner, for Philip Hammond, for David Cameron, for Justine Greening, for Nicky Morgan, for Gavin Williamson, and some others. And not a single one of those valued detachment from its civil servants. So it's not their fault. We are detached, and we can't blame them. All of the ministers I worked for wanted the civil servants advising them to know what they were talking about and be able to get it done. All of them. I mean, there may be some who don't, but I didn't ever work for any of them. So I conclude from that, sample of 15 over 20 years, that it comes from us, that the detachment comes from the civil service. And culture, in my view, is always the most important thing. You're a young person, you join the civil service. Why do you join it? I would ask everybody. I would, at induction sessions, would come in to make a difference. And you look at the top of the civil service, and detachment is what you see. The Social Mobility Commission published a report, Navigating the Labyrinth, a few years ago. Why is it so hard for working class young people, however bright, to succeed in the civil service? Why is the class-based nature of the senior civil service no more diverse than it was in 1967? They asked themselves in 2017. And they named the culture as studied neutrality, which they broke down into 3 categories. This was based on 100 interviews. Received pronunciation, tick. Emotional detachment, there's your D word, tick. An intellectual approach to culture and politics. That's what gets you, they thought, to the top of the civil service. And why doesn't it change? I guess like any organisation, if the people at the top have a particular characteristic, they're unlikely to want to change it themselves because they got to the top. And they've got a fair degree of self-confidence. So it would only change if change were imposed upon it. I don't mean that nothing can change. Gus O'Donnell was a rather impressive cabinet secretary I worked for. Passion, he had 4 Ps. This alliteration goes a long way. Passion was the one that was interesting, because we all thought we were supposed to be dispassionate. We were working for a person who wanted to be passionate. Now we're talking. Off we went for the day to West London to speak to the people. I mean, it's not very far and it's not very long, but it was more than normal. I was in the immigration service in Heathrow. I remember another permanent secretary, he wants me to go to a job centre in Hounslow. Receive pronunciation, tick. And then Gus left. So the civil service won't change itself. Ministers could change it because they're in charge, but they've got inflation. They've got the health service. They've got the Middle East. So in my view, this would only change if it were opened up to public scrutiny. If the public could see, you haven't the faintest idea what happened in any of my meetings with Tony Blair or David Cameron or Liam Fox or Philip Hammond, because it's all done in secret. It's very easy to be detached if nobody's watching. Open it up. If you were to see how literary allusions get ranked much more highly than delivery ability, I bet it would change. As Michael Caine once put it, blow the bloody doors off.
I'm trying desperately to think of a Shakespearean quote that I can throw in here, but I've got nothing. So Hannah White, let's say we've produced a wonderfully skilled civil service. The culture has been pepped up by our new government minister, Jonathan Slater. The IFG has just released an important new paper. I think it's going to be talked about for a while, on the centre of government and how it should run. And the report includes some pretty frank assessments. To quote, "Number 10 Downing Street, the Cabinet Office and the Treasury are not capable of meeting the challenges facing the United Kingdom in the 2020s and beyond. The centre of government must become more strategic, better able to set direction and hold the rest of government accountable for delivery." And you've made some very sort of clear structural recommendations for how to change the civil service. Can you talk us through the problem and the solution?
Yes, thanks very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here, and congratulations to the Bennett Institute for a fantastic conference. I know it's not easy to put on such a packed and interesting day of events, so it's a privilege to be here. Yes, how kind of you to say. We have just published a report on which focuses on structure, not because we think that the things that Ange and Jonathan have just talked about aren't important. We absolutely think that there is no way in which, if you fix structures at the centre of government, that can save you if you have the wrong people and the wrong culture. But it is nonetheless true that if you have really effective people in the centre of government, and indeed the rest of government, if you have the wrong structures or counterproductive structures, it can make them less effective. So that was why we focused in on these questions of structure in this report. And it's interesting, one of the pieces of feedback we've had from some people has been to say, no, don't strengthen the centre of government, because if you get a bad Prime Minister, think what they might do with it. And our response to that is just, ineffective government is not a constitutional safeguard. So ultimately, if you want a constitutional safeguard, set them up, but don't do it by having a centre that doesn't work. So what are we saying? I mean, I think the reason we did the piece of work is because we think there's clear evidence that structures at the centre have been problematic. Again, if you look at the examples of COVID, the centre really struggled over a period of months to find the right structures to deal with the decision-making at the centre. And got there eventually. In the end, the COVID task force ended up being pretty effective, but structure was really important. And to take a different example, if you look at the Boris Johnson policy of levelling up, which he sort of came in 2019 saying, this is a really important priority, it's going to be a key priority for my government. Because that was such a cross-cutting policy area, and as has been already said today, because of silos, which are admittedly characteristics of all organisations, but central and government and the sort of Whitehall struggles to deal with cross-cutting policy. It took about sort of 2 years for the white paper around levelling up, articulating what that meant, to come into being. And by that time, we'd had a couple of spending reviews, so the spending processes and structures had done their thing. So they'd had to set the budgets for levelling up in the abstract of policy, because the policy didn't exist because it hadn't got there, which meant that they set the envelope, and then in the end, the white paper had to retrofit itself to the budget that was available. So I think we're clear that there are problems. So essentially what we do in the paper is argue that the civil service needs reform and would benefit from being separated out from the Cabinet Office into a separate department for the civil service, led by a head of the civil service, split away from the Cabinet Secretary, so you have somebody who is really focused on that role. And although there have been some cabinet secretaries who have been better at managing to do both sides of that role, we think the evidence is that it's not a doable job anymore to do both those things. And the people that can do both well are rare, and it would be much to benefit the civil service to have someone who is actually focused on that role, and that they then need the accountability structures that flow down through their own department to manage perm sex, to tell the perm sex what they want done, and that all needs to be, if it's not going to suffer from the problems that we saw when that model was tried last time, you need to underpin that with a statute for the civil service, setting out the structures and the accountabilities, and you need to give it the additional bolster of political sponsorship in the form of what we call a new First Secretary of State role, somebody responsible for the delivery of government policy, who would be the political sponsor for that department. So I'll leave it there, but I can go into it more.
Thank you very much, Hannah. And I'm just scribbling notes here because you mentioned there the last time this was tried. So under the coalition government, people remember Bob Kerslake and Jeremy Haywood had these roles. The roles were split. Am I right in assuming the reason it was discontinued was because it was seen as not working? And you're confident that with a statutory underpinning it would work this time?
So there are a number of things that were different around that model. So Bob Kerslake was trying to run a department as well as being head of the civil service. He didn't have line management responsibility for all the other permanent secretaries. He didn't have his own political sort of leader who was giving him that closeness to the political decision-making at the centre, which we think is really crucial and which you could have if you created this first secretary role. And there was no statutory underpinning which would really make clear, and I think this comes back to Jonathan's point about openness. Our system is currently hampered by the lack of clarity over accountability between civil servants and ministers. And it works at the moment, my colleague Jill Rutter put it, it works because there's a fudge whereby civil servants don't call out ministers for trying to do foolish things, but ministers pay for that by taking accountability if those foolish things go wrong. That only works if everything's closed and no one can see what's going on. So we say, set out in a statute what the accountabilities are, who's responsible for what, give civil servants a responsibility for a stewardship function, basically. The long-term capability of the civil service should be the responsibility of perm sex and the policy making for ministers.
Excellent. So, I mean, in terms of a discussion to flow from that, so one could make the critique that the more we centralise power, the more there is a potential to maybe institutionalise groupthink. So I'm interested in this groupthink idea, and Ange, if I can come back to you on this. So when you looked at the UK government, how it responded to COVID, is there a sense there that there is enough internal challenge, or the current structures and cultures as they were during COVID sort of lead to groupthink type responses?
Well, there are several interesting things to say about that. One is that if you think about one of the flagship things that did very well was the vaccine task force, which actually sat above everything and reported directly. I think Dame Kate Bingham was reporting directly to the Prime Minister. So you're bypassing, essentially, what should be your kind of first port of call for running the country in a crisis, right? The second thing was, we also had, as government by WhatsApp, as we've found out at the COVID inquiry, because those formal structures didn't work very effectively, or certainly they weren't working on the time frame that kept pace with a rapidly unfolding epidemic. And that is unusual because not every crisis moves at that pace. But on the other hand, you need to be able to move at least as fast as the crisis is unfolding, and preferably faster. to second guess it. The other thing about groupthink, what's really interesting is I think those early SAGE meetings, because I should be clear, you know, I was really exploring the scientific side and how that interfaced with policy making. So this is about what you do in a scientific crisis, and so the SAGE, the Science Advisory Group on Emergencies, was essentially kind of collating advice at speed, disseminating it. But what was interesting, I think, is that people skirted around the idea of lockdowns. That was the first thing, because nobody really wanted to float the idea, or certainly civil servants seemed reluctant to float the idea because they thought ministers wouldn't go for it. And so they didn't want to, there was a feeling that perhaps the ideas that were kind of being tried elsewhere in other countries were not on the table for cultural reasons. And I think that was interesting because one of the, if you look at what places like Japan, Korea, you know, where the virus hit first, Thailand, the first thing that they were doing were looking at what was happening in the countries that the virus had already manifested in and was learning from that. So there were, you know, there were real problems, I think, in terms of the government structures to do things, the way information was feeding into from the research, which was live and continuous, because all the information was still yet to be known. It was unfolding, and then that had to go through to, you know, what the policies would be, and then somebody would have to make a decision on it. And that, I think, was a really tough challenge, and I don't think we should kind of sit here and say that was easy. We know what we should have done, but there's certainly, in hindsight, you can sort of see that where there were tensions. Mm.
Jonathan, what about you? So when you were in your permanent secretary role, would you say there was evidence of groupthink in the civil service? And to what extent are the kind of structural changes that Hannah White is talking about a potential solution to such problems, or on the flip side, a potential contributor to such problems?
Well, clearly an organisation which is not very diverse at senior levels is going to encourage a narrower set of views than a more diverse one. Clearly an organisation whose culture is one of studied neutrality is not likely to be exposing the arguments as much as it might. As a fairly new permanent secretary, I was being asked to introduce a new form of post-16 qualification more quickly than my predecessor had been asked to reform GCSEs. And I checked on my responsibilities as a permanent secretary. And back in about 2011, something like that, 2010, 2011, the permanent secretary of the Treasury had issued a rule for permanent secretaries that required them to report to the National Audit Office if they were being asked to do something for which there was a significant doubt as to how as it could be achieved at the speed that ministers wanted it to be done. Okay. So just before I wrote to the National Audit Office, I thought I'd better look at previous letters written by other permanent secretaries in the previous 7 years so that I'd follow the format. There wasn't a single one. So, how unlucky was I? The first permanent secretary in 7 years had been asked to do something too fast.
You drew the short straw of fate, Jonathan. So Hannah, to put that back to you then, in terms of the kind of critique around groupthink, the kind of critique around centralisation leading to fewer checks and balances, if you like, under the classic Westminster tradition. Is that a concern? And how does the sort of set of fixes that you've landed on address those things?
Yeah, so I mean, I was really struck, just to build on Jonathan's point about the lack of diversity at the centre, by the evidence that that Helen McNamara gave to the COVID inquiry, where she said...
I was thinking the same.
She was sitting in meetings talking about the risks around football matches and COVID, and realised that nobody else in the room had ever been to a football match. And she gave some really powerful evidence, I think, about the lack, the lack of diversity in decision making right at the centre. I think, one of the things that the previous IFG work looked at was, again, building on what Anjana said, during the pandemic, the lack of external evidence taken on board by the Treasury by comparison with the SAGE process. So the SAGE process,
yes,
for all its failings, trying to gather in different scientific evidence, whereas the Treasury, we did some work looking at this, was quite closed and engaged much less. But then the problem at the centre, which we've tried to address in our sort of structural sort of thinking, was that you sort of had a stream of the science evidence coming in via SAGE to the centre, and you had the Treasury view of the economic evidence. But what you really, the gap at the centre was a sort of assessment process which brought together those two streams and gave a sort of a combined view to politicians. So really those two different sort of arguments were landing on the desk of politicians, and they were being asked to do that in a way that, if you look at something like the way we handle national security at the centre with the National Security Council and the Joint Intelligence Committee, which sort of brings in analysis and then does assessment and then presents that was just absent. So one of the things we're talking about in order to make decisions better at the centre, which take account of a wider range of evidence and help politicians make use of that evidence, whatever their backgrounds might be, whether they're scientists or humanities graduates or whatever it is just a better synthesis of the information that's available. And then we also talk a lot about the need for the centre to be more open, not just in crisis situations, to different parts of government, to different parts of the public service, and also far beyond, because we feel it's too easy for the centre to get into a kind of bunker mentality, which means they then start trying to sort of micromanage everything themselves, rather than being strong enough to delegate, sort of counterintuitively.
There's a nice theme here about openness and about transparency. And if I'm remembering my Yes Minister correctly, there was a lovely little exchange about Sir Humphrey saying to the Minister, you can either have government or you can have open government. You cannot have both.
Can I just quickly come in on something?
Of course.
Yeah, just the point you made, Hannah, I think was really interesting. And it speaks to the idea of trade-offs that have come up a lot, because I do remember this book. This wasn't just me. This was written. The book was written with Jeremy Farrar, who's one of the SAGE advisors, and there's an email that I remember him sending to Patrick Vallance, and this was in that kind of hectic, surreal week in the lead up to the first lockdown. And I remember sort of typing it in and sort of kind of reliving it all. But and Jeremy puts in the email to Patrick Vallance where he's talking, because at that point SAGE is trying to keep a consensus, and he says to Patrick Vallance, now may not be the time to keep a consensus if it means it slows us down, essentially. And there you've got the classic crisis trade-off between speed and, kind of if you're waiting for everybody to agree, it's just not going to work. So at some point you do have to kind of just, be decisive, do something rather than nothing.
Yeah.
On your open government question, I spent the first 10 years of my career as a public servant in local government, working in the Islington Council for people like Margaret Hodge and James Minnell and Stephen Twigg and all sorts of people who subsequently became government ministers. A couple of miles away, anybody who tells you there's anyway, I'm not on the subject of metropolitan elites. I assumed then that the switch from Islington to Whitehall would be easy. It would just be bigger. version of the same thing. Yeah? I was an impartial official in Islington, working for elected politicians. I advised, they decided, I implemented. I worked for different political parties. It's the same, isn't it? It's completely different. What is the difference? In Islington, it's open, or it was in the 90s, and in Whitehall, it's closed. So, you know, if you want to be the sort of civil servant who runs rings around your minister, yes, minister, which, by the way, is no longer the system, right? It may have been true in the past. It isn't the case that civil servants are running rings around their ministers at all. That is not the critique anymore. But if that's what you want to do, you want to do it in secret. There's plenty of local government that's not very good, but there is plenty of local government that is. And when I had to advise Islington Council which primary school should close because there weren't enough kids, so not an uncontroversial decision, I made that recommendation in a public meeting of councillors from different political parties. I thought nothing of it. I wanted to make sure I knew what I was talking about, that I was right on the basis of the evidence, because I was being watched. And I thought, do you know what? I might as well go and talk to the children and their parents and the teachers beforehand, because I want to know if I've missed something. And I felt really quite accountable for that advice. And nobody thought I was politically impartial or that the Constitution would fall apart. Why do civil servants not operate like that? It's not much fun, right? I'm just going to come and explain to you why I'm going to close your school. I'm never going to forget that meeting. Not having had that meeting, not having that meeting, behind closed doors, easy. Doing it in public, better. Make it happen.
But does that expose you to a role that, under our Westminster system of government, should really belong to ministers?
Yeah.
Well, because the chair of education was there, I was offering him my advice. Here are 3 sets of schools. My job as a civil servant is to offer impartial advice, whatever the politicians. You could do that or that or that or that. Here are the pros and cons of each. It's not to make a recommendation as to which. I love politics. I love politicians. I don't think there are right answers. That's the point of politicians. The point of civil servants is you could do A, B, C, or D. And if you're supposed to say that, whatever the politics, whoever the politician, why is it a secret? Why isn't it public? Why isn't it public?
Hannah has an answer.
No, but just to build on that, I mean, I think one of the things that's come up in other sessions is about expertise in the civil service and the need to find ways of enabling more experts to bring their expertise in. And I think one of the problems, one of the disincentives to people who are expert to going in at a more senior level into government is the idea that they will trash their reputations because they will give evidence, they will make a recommendation and it will be ignored, and the minister will do something else, and people will say, hang on, isn't that Jonathan Slater advising that minister? And actually, if there was more openness around the advice that was being given, they could say, well, this was the advice, and there might be a recommendation, but absolutely, it's the role of the politician to decide. But I think you can build trust between politicians and civil servants if actually everyone's clear on what their role is, and it's the murkiness which then sometimes tempts some ministers to blame civil servants, or civil servants to make a mistake and then let their minister take the rap for it, which then is corrosive of that trust, which is something that we've seen.
And that potential for blame games to happen if you're having conversations in public that you used to be able to have in private and sort of come out with a resolved view. Whereas if you become a public figure, could we hypothesise that someone like Tom Scholar at the Treasury is no longer at the Treasury because there was a perception about the kind of views that he held? And if that was a public public result that then happened as a result of a public style of conversation rather than a quiet one in the back room. We could go on. I'm going to ask for some questions from the audience, I think, to see how else we can fix the civil service. So I can see hands going up. We have microphones coming your way, and let's start on the next to Diane. Yes. Oh, Mark, there you are.
Struggling a bit with a lot of 21st century challenges, especially stuff that we can't measure well, like social cohesion. And I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on how to restructure or reform the civil service in terms of what comes after new public management. Do we need more participatory governance, more new public service, a relational state, design thinking? What are your attitudes to that?
Mark, thank you. I'll come, yes, please, Mr. Mayor, in the middle. Is that coming through?
Identified myself as one of the politicians in the room as a Metro Mayor for Cambridge and Peterborough. I'm grateful that Jonathan highlighted the differences between national and local government. I'll cut to the chase. My question will be, in terms of reform and acknowledging more and more combined authorities and a new kind of way of delivering government at a local level, what is the role for a regional civil service? And I say that in the context of referring to your references, Anjana. You talked about skilling up. Well, I would argue good local politicians who deliver good local national policy are skilled up in local knowledge about bus routes, schools, preschool. And you talk about being curious and connected. Well, I'll take that because as somebody who stood and successfully been elected here, about another few C's. 3 C's of compassion, cooperation, and delivering for your community. So I will take your curious and connected, but I would argue you've got the makings of a reform and a reimagined civil service. If only you can take it out of Westminster, give it to the local government, civil service officers, also known as public servants. And in honour of a man who you have mentioned today, Bob Kerslake, who took a lot of time to support the current Metro mayors, and that is Ben Houchin as much as it is Andy Street or Andy Burnham, and particularly myself, when I walked into a role I wasn't quite expecting to get. But I am grateful for your opinion. Where does devolution stand taking this forward?
I'm so glad somebody asked that, because I was sitting there earlier thinking about what's happened to the regional development authorities and, you know, the Midlands Engine, Northern Powerhouse and things like that. So, but I'm no expert in those.
Let's take one more to add to that mix. Yes, in the middle here, please.
Thank you. Tom Goldie from Cambridge University Press and Assessment. What is the ideal size of the civil service in the 21st century? And to follow on from what Jonathan was saying, should civil service advice to ministers be laid before the House alongside legislation?
Thank you very much. The publication of civil service advice, interesting. Well, shall we start with that? So the ideal size of the civil service, maybe Hannah, you might have a view on that, and then Jonathan on the publication of civil service advice.
I mean, I'm going to completely cop out and say it depends what politicians want the civil service to do, but I think that is the key thing, because we've seen recently sort of an unhealthy degree, I think, of sort of arbitrary headcount targets set. Politicians seeing that essentially we've had a perfect V in terms of civil service numbers from 2010 that dropped down to 2016 and then has come back up to where it was. And I think that the current government acknowledges that we are now doing things post-Brexit that we weren't doing before because the EU was doing them for us, and so we do need we've had to set up some different things and ask UK civil servants to do some of those things, so the numbers do need to be higher. We also took on more civil servants to deal with COVID, but just saying, well, let's have 90,000 fewer civil servants without starting from a sort of zero-based idea of, well, what are the things that we want our civil service to be delivering, I think is difficult, because you end up with all sorts of counterproductive things like more use of consultants and things which end up being more expensive. So I think it's, there is no ideal size. You need to articulate what it is that you want the civil service to do. Harking back to previous discussions, I think the really interesting question is how new technologies can change the jobs of civil servants, so then maybe there's more capacity for them to do more interesting jobs and not some of the more boring things which AI, for example, can now do on their behalf.
Jonathan, the publication of civil service advice.
In my experience, the meeting that permanent secretaries hate more than any other is the meeting where they attend a public accounts committee, which happens to be the only meeting that they do in public, in which they're being scrutinised and held to account for their advice. Not on the pros and cons of different options, but on a much narrower set of questions about value for money. Because about 100 years ago, the Treasury decided that permanent secretaries should have that responsibility. Anyway, it doesn't matter what the reason is. And so the National Audit Office goes and has a look at that advice, narrowly defined in respect to value for money, and offers a view as to whether or not the department was doing a good job and serving the ministers well or badly in respect of that element of it. And so I would be in front of the Select Committee, and but if any member of Parliament said to me, well, what about the advice you gave on policy choices? I would say, oh, I'm so sorry, I can't possibly answer that question because there's a set of rules that prevent me from doing so. As a matter of fact, therefore, there is quite a simple solution, which is give the National Audit Office and Parliament the same remit for looking at the quality of advice and the extent to which the evidence is put in front of Greg Clark or any other minister, as in respect to value for money. It's perfectly possible. The change I would make would not be to do it after the event, because obviously that's a bit suboptimal. That's just finding out who to blame. The time to do it is in advance, as in the case of Islington Council, so that if somebody spots there's some evidence that's missing, they've got the chance to feed it in. I mean, if you were designing a system to run the country today, would you really design a system in which the most senior people advising the ministers aren't scientists, do it in secret? Why do we put up with it?
We'll take that as a rhetorical question.
Well, in science, we have something called peer review. That's how science kind of lives and dies and survives or doesn't survive. And that is where you publish you get your methods, you cite your sources and your footnotes, and you say how you did whatever it was, whatever study you looked at the outcomes, and your peers come along and say, well, was that a reasonable study to do? It's a bit like, bringing in Gillian's point, it's about context, it's seeing the wood for the trees. Does this look like a reasonable study with a reasonable sample size? Does the outcome look reasonable? Was the knowledge that fed into the design of that study reasonable? And so, for example, one of the things that I thought about a lot during the pandemic was who has ministerial ears? And that came out with the Great Barrington crowd. How was it that they had such a hold on ministerial thinking with so little challenge? So there are ways of doing things that I suppose, I know if I was to be lofty about it, science is about the pursuit of truth. And you know, you are trying to objectively sort of strive for something that is real and truthful. And that sits quite unhappily sometimes with a more ideological way of looking at the world. And again, I think it was Giles Wilkes mentioned this about, you know, the ministerial skill set is slightly different. They're going for election. But I just wanted to put that in there because that, again, you don't necessarily need to have a STEM degree to know that, but it's about thinking critically, actually. I just can't emphasise that enough. But I would love to know what gets thrown into the policy pool. How do we end up with, you know, how do we end up, for example, I was talking about this at lunch with someone in Camden, where I live, where we have cycle lanes which are bollarded off, which is a great idea for a very slow cyclist like me, but actually all it's done has funneled other cyclists into a narrower section of the road, and as a result is kind of slowing down traffic in certain places. I want, you know, I am a cyclist, I'm also a motorist, I'm a pedestrian, so it's that having that kind of holistic view of policy. But I also wanted to come back to this point about being compassionate. When I talked about being a curious and connected citizen, it is about having those conversations. It's always struck me as someone who has not come from a posh part of the world, has not had a posh upbringing, just, you know, going into science and then going into journalism, and then moving in circles like this, just how homogenous actually people's backgrounds are, and how they don't have conversations with people at supermarket tills. They don't, and when I look at things like, for example, the redefinition of extremism, and I think, well, what does that do to marginalised communities? How might that make me feel? How much dialogue and you know, sort of discussion has gone into that? So it is having that sense of compassion as well. I absolutely agree. But I do think actually most civil servants do go into it for good reasons and are compassionate and want to do the right thing and want to serve the public. And it's about, I guess, when we're talking about reform, is how best to equip them to do that.
Hannah, you want to
I just wanted to pick up quickly on Jonathan's point about the PAC and the accounting officer role, because one of the interesting ideas I heard, I can't remember for the life of me in what forum recently, but I've undertaken to think myself more about, is your question about the sort of the role of the regional civil servants and so on, and whether we might get further faster with the English devolution agenda and particularly fiscal devolution if we thought about having accounting officers who are accountable then to Parliament from a regional level, and that might make people in Whitehall a bit more relaxed about some of that devolution, because they wouldn't feel ultimately that they were the ones who were going to have to appear before the PAC, because there would be that trickle down of accountability, if you like. And I think that's a very interesting thing to explore. Maybe people here have really thought about it, in which case I'd be interested to know what you think.
And collectively, can we have a go at Mark's question about what follows new public management, the culture of the bureaucracy, outcomes, measurement? Are we moving towards a more deliberative, participative sort of a model of the civil service, or is that not what this machine was built to do?
That is a big question, isn't it? It's certainly broader than the role of the civil service. And the last few years, haven't been the most straightforward politically. So we'll have to see what happens next. For myself, a better connection between people who advise politicians and frontline professionals doing their work day to day must be an important part of the answer. A better connection between the public at large and the decision makers likewise. So those would be two elements. The sort of model in which Whitehall knows best, you give us your money, we'll do it for you, has probably achieved as much as it can. I mean, I'm biased, I suppose. My father was a teacher, my mother was a social worker. I thought they were great. I saw my job as the permanent secretary of the department that, can it really be a coincidence? Was the department that oversaw teaching and children's social work? I don't know. I saw my job and encouraged the people working for me to think of themselves as people who, I actually put it this way, I went to every induction meeting and I said to staff who were arriving, just imagine tomorrow the Department for Education didn't exist. £500 million a year would be saved. That would employ quite a lot of teachers and social workers. What would happen the day after that? Would teachers and social workers say, no, what we're going to need to do is create an organisation of experts in the centre to set us some targets and tell us what to do? Or would they take the money and employ some more teachers and social workers? And I was only half joking. You know, we in the end were an overhead, and headquarters tend to destroy more value than they add. And not just in the civil service, even in universities. And so a really good question, maybe not in universities, I don't know. But a really good question in the headquarters of any organisation is, are you adding more value than you're destroying? And how do you know? You certainly cost a lot. I mean, the cost of the people we employed is obviously much less than the cost of the instructions we issue. Is the value that's achieved from the spreading of best practice, all that, does it exceed the cost? That would be a great question to ask every single day.
Let's cap this loose revolutionary talk for a moment and come back to some more questions. I've got one from online, and then I'll take a couple from the room. And the one online is asking about how we practically break down silos. Are there lessons to be learned from the Darlington campus model, the sort of co-location, collaboration model to bring government closer to the people? And two more from the room, please. Yes, at the back. Thank you.
Thank you. Not long ago, John Major, I think at an IFG event, recalled fondly a few decades ago an informal poll of universities where he asked people who wanted to go into public service. And I think he said nearly half of people would put their hands up, compared to almost zero these days. We also saw recently, I think for the third year in a row, a fall in the number of people applying to the fast stream. Is this concerning, and what can civil service reform do to address this?
Thank you, and I'll take one more. First in the red, patiently, yes. Thanks, Blossom.
Thank you. My question is actually a bit linked to that one. I'm a student here at the university studying public policy and undergrad, and I was in the civil service over summer for an internship. And on the first day, they said impartiality and the dispassionate that we've already been talking about in this seminar, and neutrality. Now, as a politics student, this was a bit of a, obviously to be expected, but a bit of a kick in the teeth. Because you want to be passionate, right? That's where the work gets done. That's where you enjoy what you do and are most effective. And I suppose what I'm asking is, thinking about reforms and thinking about getting young people into the civil service, if you're going into politics from more working class backgrounds through things like activism and wanting to make a difference, then will the culture change inspire also a change in the applicants, and should it be viewed as holistically as that?
Thank you very much. Three excellent questions. Who wants to have a go at co-location, collaboration, close to the people? This sounds like you, Jonathan Slater.
When I worked for Justine Greening, as Education Secretary, she described herself as a working class girl who'd grown up in Rotherham and made it. She was Education Secretary, and she thought that 30 years later it was a lot harder. And her vision was to tackle that. That's a vision to get out of bed for. That's a reason to make a difference, isn't it? And so she asked me to put in place, she asked me to move DfE civil servants to work in Hastings, in Blackpool, and so on, in some of the most challenged areas of the country. I mean, obviously, a more radical model would be to transfer the responsibility back to local government again. But sticking with the civil service, that's what she did. And by the way, obviously, I would, if it were me, devolve the responsibility. We're the most centralised country in Europe, and it's bad. But given that we're focusing here on the civil service, and the mindset of the people who, DfE civil servants, now in Hastings and in Blackpool and so on, you know, it didn't take long to change, because they're spending now time with children in schools every day, and ministers rarely. And it's still, they're still working for the ministers, and they still advise the minister what they think. But it's a real change for them. This is what I was most struck by talking to them, because are they going to say to the minister, yeah, you can get away with, you know, X or Y, knowing that that's what the minister really wants? No, they're not going to do it anymore, because they're going to explain to the kids in the school the next day what they said, because they feel a sense of connection. They feel like they care. So that the Constitution hasn't changed, the accountability hasn't changed, but the amount of time you're spending with different people has changed. New Zealand is a parliamentary democracy like ours. A Director General who used to work for me went to spend 18 months responsible for children's services in New Zealand. Same model. He came back, he said to me, "God, you know what, Jonathan? Guess how many times I had a meeting with ministers each week?" And the answer was 1. Whereas previously it was 30. Right? It just completely changes. And if you think about it, what, 30? Why would you want to be in a meeting with ministers so often? How often do you need instruction from your ministers about what to do? It's become a model in which we just spend all our time in meetings with ministers. It doesn't help them. If we spend some more time with the public, tell them what we know, then they decide, and we get on and do it.
To pick up the passion question, I mean, is there room for the civil service to allow more politically engaged, passionate type people in? Could we break down the culture? Hannah, you're nodding?
Yeah, I mean, I think to combine that with the question about, you know, people wanting to go into public service and John Major's point, which thank you, that was an IFG event, thank you for watching it. I think it is a concern. I mean, I think the drop in applications to the fast stream, I mean, obviously it's partly because of the short-sighted decision to stop the fast stream briefly, which was reversed. But, you know, there's been, I think it's a 46% drop over 3 years in applications to the fast stream. Still a very highly rated graduate scheme. A 78% drop in STEM applications to the fast stream, even though people like Patrick Vallance and so on have been focusing on that being a major thing that they're trying to up. And I did a valedictory in-conversation event with Alex Chisholm the other day and put those figures to him. And he was very blasé about it, if you ask me. I mean, I think he ought to have been, he said, oh, you know, well, the quality is still just as high of the people who are choosing to apply. But I think, yeah, as I say, I think that was very blasé, and I think it is a concern. And I think that we need to be thinking precisely about what you were saying about people these days really are focusing on, you know, what is the difference I'm going to be making by choosing this career. I'm not saying people in the past didn't do that, but I think it's a characteristic of people sort of graduating these days that is a very high priority for them. And so I think the civil service needs to do a better job of sort of marketing itself as a place where there are tremendous opportunities to take responsibility and to make a difference and to have a high degree of responsibility at a relatively junior level and all those positive things. But I think the civil service over the last decade has got into a pretty low ebb in terms of morale and being criticised publicly by ministers and so on. And it hasn't been doing a good job itself of making the argument of why people should want to come into the civil service. And I think that is what's being reflected in the fast stream applications. And I think it is a concern. So I think there needs to be a bit of a reset.
Can I just say, in terms of the recruitment, I can probably talk a bit to that, because I think I would be delighted to join a civil service that was really, really hard to get into, paid really relatively poorly, and to get into a job where you're going to be pretty much insulted by ministers, as you are at the moment. So yeah, it's all good. And I just think, if I am a STEM graduate, obviously, but I can absolutely see pragmatic reasons why you would not go into the civil service, particularly at the moment. And also you'd be living in one of the most expensive areas in the country. And so if salaries, for example, I mean, if you are a STEM graduate, and I'm not at all surprised about the lack of STEM graduates going, a lot of my friends went into the city. If you look at the other recruitment sort of sectors that are competing for STEM talent, and actually just talent overall, you've got the city, you've got private enterprise. When you think about AI, the AI industry in this country, I was at the Turing Institute's annual conference earlier this week, and there were representatives from the UK government, the US government, and the EU. All, so the EU's just introduced the AI Act, and all of them were talking about the difficulty of getting people in on governance, i.e. into the civil service and those kinds of roles, because they just could not compete with the salaries being offered by the industry. So, and that is worrying in a way, because you've got this hugely important tech that's coming through. And this was referred to probably in the panel earlier by Brittany. I'm sorry, I've forgotten her surname, but she was from OpenAI. You've got this huge tech that's going to probably be embedded across lots and lots of different areas of our lives within the next 5, maybe even 3, 4, 5 years. And it is all going to be dictated to the way that embedding is going to be dictated by the industry itself, with not for want of trying, but with a lack of oversight, I think, a lack of sufficiently sort of technocratic oversight at the highest levels of government. And that really, really worries me.
We're very close to time, so let me take back control from the chair. That was not a Brexit allusion. To ask a big final question that I said I wasn't going to do, and now I'm going to do it. Power of the microphone goes to your head, which is the final outcome of the discussion about either reform or revolution, if you like, in terms of the civil service and what's required. Are we in a Northcote Trevelyan moment where actually everything needs to change? We need to really state clearly what the civil service is for, what we want it to do, who we want to be in it? Or actually, are we okay and we just need some, smaller scale reform to bring things back into line? I'll ask all three of you to respond, but Hannah, I'll start with you.
So I think I've already nailed our colours to the mast with a year-long commission on this. But I would say what I was really struck by doing a year-long commission on the centre of government was the consistency of agreement about the problems, and problems with the civil service as well as with the centre of government more generally. And there's just been report after report after report which has identified the same problems around churn, as Greg Clark was saying earlier, around accountability, around openness, as we've been saying here. And everyone sort of says, okay, we'll produce a sort of a list of micro things to do, and we'll go away and do them, and then political and official kind of leadership behind that gets distracted by all the other very important things that government is doing, and it sort of doesn't happen, and then 10 years later we have another report. So I would say we need more of a step change, and we need to try, there isn't a since we published this report, we've had lots of people agree with us. We've also had lots of people disagree with us. You know, there are different possible answers, but I would say we need to try something a bit more radical. And a good moment to do that is after an election. So let's see.
Thank you. Jonathan?
Well, look, there are bigger problems than the civil service if one is addressing the quality of public services and the nature of government. So it's not my top priority. I mean, I've been focusing on it because it was the subject of the discussion. But the absence of, the lack of engagement between the electorate and the politicians, the consent for the democratic system in which we operate is right up there at the top, isn't it? I mean, the public just hates government and politics and politicians, and it's completely hopeless at the moment, isn't it? I'm not making a party political point, but nobody could say the current system is working. So start that, obviously. We're a fantastically centralised nation, which isn't working. So then go to there. But if the next question is the machine capable of delivering, then obviously I think it isn't. I'm just talking about the policy-making function, right? I mean, it's completely different. There's some fantastically high-quality, high-professional, well-organised public servants at the delivery end. Under a lot of pressure. But my critique is a critique of Whitehall, which is definitely broken. And the criticisms and the challenges we've been offering are exactly the same as they were in 1968, when Fulton reported to Harold Wilson, concluding that the problem with Whitehall back in 1968 was that a group of amateurs moving between departments too quickly, expert only in the administrative process. Essentially, it's the same critique as Haldane in 1918, right? So if you want it to change, you've definitely got to blow the bloody doors off.
So you think it's all going well. Okay. And Ange, for you, please.
What they said. As I say, I'm no expert, but I think always, given the title that we've got, for me, always the question is always, what is the purpose of the civil service? What is it there to do? Does it do it? And if it does it do it well, does it serve the people in a way? Although, is that ministers really a ministerial job? But does it do what it sets out to do? Does it do it well? And if it doesn't, then where are the flaws? How can we fix them? Because I do think, I think it's a treasure. It is something that is looked up to in many, many places. And it seems such a shame for it to be struggling like it did. But we've gone through that learning experience of the pandemic. And there are things that came out there that we know that kind of need fixing, and maybe there is. I really like the idea of the Department of Civil Service. Actually, that idea that somebody is taking care of it and looking after it as a thing across the board and has ownership of it. And I have to be optimistic, because otherwise, where are we?
Well, it feels like we're in the mood for revolution up here. I'm sure that will cause some interesting discussions later on over drinks. That is the end of our time for this session. Just before we applaud the panel, a reminder that we are back in only 10 minutes or 15. I've miscounted. 15 minutes. So just a short comfort break, please. We'll come back for the keynote. I want to thank and ask you to join me in thanking the panel for a great discussion.